highway stretched endlessly into the dark, a narrow ribbon of asphalt cutting through the frozen wilderness. Snow fell steadily, swirling under the glow of the headlights as Ryan tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He had been driving for hours, his eyelids heavy, the steady hum of his truck's engine lulling him into a trance. The heater blasted warm air, but the creeping exhaustion made it hard to stay focused. He told himself he would stop at the next gas station, maybe grab a coffee. But out here in the middle of nowhere, such places were few and far between. The landscape on either side of the road was a vast, empty stretch of snow-covered trees. No houses, no gas stations, no signs of life. Just the endless road ahead and the eerie silence that came with winter nights. The highway had a strange way of making a man feel small, like he was the last soul left in the world. Then he saw her. A lone figure stood on the side of the highway, just beyond the reach of his high beams. A woman wearing a thin, tattered dress, far too light for the freezing weather. Her long, dark hair hung over her face, concealing her features, and her arms were wrapped tightly around herself as if trying to fight off the cold. She didn't wave or stick out her thumb. She just stood there, motionless. Ryan slowed the truck, his gut twisting uneasily. Something about her presence sent a chill up his spine. Who in their right mind would be out here, in the dead of winter, dressed like that? Maybe she had been in an accident, or maybe she had walked away from a broken-down car. He couldn't just leave her there. He rolled down his window slightly. "Hey, do you need a ride?" The woman didn't move for a moment, but then slowly, she lifted her head. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. Her face was pale, almost unnaturally so. Her lips slightly parted, as if she were about to speak, but had forgotten how. Then, she gave the smallest nod and took a step forward. Something in Ryan's gut screamed at him to leave. His instincts told him to hit the gas and keep driving, but his rational side told him she was just a stranded woman in need of help. He reached over and unlocked the door. The woman climbed into the passenger seat, moving unnaturally slow, as if her limbs were stiff. She sat with perfect posture, her hands neatly folded in her lap, staring straight ahead. Ryan cleared his throat, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. "Where are you headed?" he asked, forcing a friendly tone. Silence. Ryan glanced at her, expecting her to at least give a nervous smile, but she remained expressionless. "You okay?" he asked again. "Do you need me to call someone?" Still, no response. The silence in the truck was suffocating. Ryan turned up the heater, trying to distract himself, but the air in the cabin felt colder than before. He noticed something strange. The windows were starting to fog up, but not from warmth. A thin layer of frost was creeping along the glass from the inside. His heartbeat quickened. "Lady, are you sure you're—" "Be careful," she whispered. Ryan's stomach twisted. Her voice was soft, barely above a breath, but it sent an icy shudder through his body. He glanced at her again, and for the first time, she turned her head to look at him. Her eyes, black, hollow voids, locked onto his. "Be careful," she said again, her lips barely moving. "He's waiting ahead." Ryan's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles turned white. "Who's waiting?" he asked, his voice shaky. But she didn't answer. And then, she was gone. The seat beside him was empty. Ryan slammed on the brakes, his heart hammering against his ribs. The truck skidded slightly before coming to a full stop. His breathing was ragged, his hands trembling as he flicked on the cabin light and twisted in his seat. Nothing. His chest rose and fell rapidly. He ran a hand over the passenger seat. It was freezing cold, as if someone had left a window open in the dead of winter. But the doors were shut. The windows were closed. It didn't make sense. Then, through the windshield, he saw it. Just ahead on the road, barely visible through the thick snow, a car sat crumpled against a tree. Its hood crushed inward, steam hissing from the wreck. Ryan's stomach dropped. The vehicle looked like it had been there for hours, maybe even days. With shaking hands, he reached for his phone to call for help. But before he could dial, his gaze drifted toward the wreckage again, and his breath caught in his throat. There, slumped in the driver's seat, was the woman. The same woman who had just been sitting next to him. Her lifeless eyes stared straight ahead, blood streaking down her face, frozen over in death. Ryan didn't wait to investigate. He threw the truck into gear and sped away, his heart pounding harder than it ever had before. He never drove that stretch of highway again. And to this day, when the winter snow falls thick and heavy, other travelers report seeing a woman standing on the roadside, her thin dress fluttering in the wind, waiting for another ride. Jason had been driving trucks for nearly 15 years, but nothing could have prepared him for what he experienced on that lonely highway in the dead of winter. It was late December, and a brutal snowstorm had blanketed the Appalachian Mountains in thick layers of ice and fog. He was hauling cargo through a remote stretch of highway, a road known among truckers as the Devil's Backbone, a name earned not just because of its dangerous curves, but because of the eerie legends surrounding it. Jason had always dismissed ghost stories and trucker myths as nonsense, just tall tales shared over coffee at truck stops. He never believed in the supernatural, but that night changed everything. The snow fell in thick sheets, making it difficult to see beyond a few feet ahead. His headlights barely cut through the swirling white haze. He hadn't seen another car in miles, and his only company was the hum of his engine and the faint crackle of his CB radio. He adjusted his grip on the wheel and checked his mirrors out of habit. That's when he saw them, a pair of headlights in the distance, following him. At first, he thought nothing of it. Maybe another trucker was on the road, keeping a steady pace behind him through the treacherous conditions. But something about these lights made his stomach clench. They didn't fade or flicker in the swirling snow like normal headlights should. They didn't get closer or farther away. They just remained exactly the same distance behind him, unwavering. After an hour of driving with the strange headlights behind him, Jason started to feel uneasy. He flicked on his CB radio and called out, "Hey, driver behind me, you out there?" Static. He tried again. "Breaker, breaker, you tailing me for a reason?" Silence. He glanced back at his mirrors. The headlights were gone. Jason exhaled in relief. Maybe they had taken an exit, or maybe it was just his tired mind playing tricks on him. He tried to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He turned his attention back to the road. Then, his truck lurched violently. Something had slammed into the back of his trailer. His entire rig shuddered, his tires skidding on the icy pavement. Jason gritted his teeth and fought to keep control of the wheel. His hands shook as he checked his mirrors again. The headlights were back, but this time, they were right beside him. Jason's breath caught in his throat. He turned his head to look, and there it was, a massive black semi-truck, completely unmarked. No logos, no numbers, no driver visible through the pitch-black windshield. It was moving in perfect sync with his truck. An eerie shadow in the storm. The strange truck veered toward him. Jason's rig shuddered violently, though there was no impact. It was as if an unseen force was pushing him, trying to shove him off the road. His tires skidded dangerously close to the guardrail. His heart pounded as he fought against the invisible pressure. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the black truck vanished. No sound, no lights fading into the distance, just gone. Jason's knuckles were white as he gripped the wheel. His breathing was ragged, his body trembling with adrenaline. He didn't know what the hell just happened, but he wasn't about to stick around to find out. He pressed down on the gas, desperate to put as much distance as possible between himself and whatever that was. He drove for another 2 hours without stopping. The snowstorm had started to clear, and the highway was quiet again. The fear in his chest began to subside. Maybe it had been a hallucination, exhaustion, playing tricks on his mind. Then, a voice came through his CB radio. Low, distorted, a whisper that made his blood run cold. "You should have pulled over." Jason's stomach twisted into a knot. His hands shook as he fumbled to respond, but before he could speak, his truck shut off. The engine died. The lights flickered. The heater stopped. His entire rig was now a dead hulk of metal in the middle of a deserted highway. The only sound was the wind howling through the trees. Jason tried the ignition. Nothing. He tried the CB radio. Static. He was alone. Then, a new sound. a faint tapping. His breath hitched as he turned toward the passenger side window. His blood turned to ice. Handprints, dozens of them, pressed against the frosted glass. Large ones, small ones, some with long, spindly fingers. And then, a shadow moved outside. Jason grabbed his flashlight and shone it toward the window. The moment the light hit the glass, the handprints vanished. He swung the flashlight outside, scanning the snow-covered road. But there was nothing. No footprints. No sign of anyone. His heart thundered as he turned the key in the ignition one more time. The truck roared back to life. Jason didn't waste a second. He slammed his foot on the gas and tore down the highway. He drove until he reached the next truck stop, where he stumbled out of his rig, shaking, breathless. He checked the back of his truck, his gut already telling him what he'd find. But it wasn't just a dent. The metal was twisted inward, warped in a way that no normal impact could have caused, and scattered across the dent, barely visible in the dim truck stoplights. More handprints. Jason never spoke of that night again, but other truckers traveling that same stretch of highway have reported seeing a black semi-truck that appears and disappears. Some say it belongs to a trucker who died decades ago, his ghost forever haunting the road. Others believe it's something far worse, something not of this world. Jason only knew one thing for certain. If you ever find yourself on an empty winter highway and a pair of headlights appear behind you, following you too perfectly, do not stop. Do not look. And never, ever pull over. Highway 93 stretched like an endless ribbon through the desolate countryside, its winding path cutting through miles of empty fields, frozen lakes, and dense forests that swallowed the road in an abyss of shadows. On this winter night, the air was thick with mist, the headlights of passing cars barely piercing through the suffocating fog. The highway was quiet, too quiet. The only sounds were the soft hum of Kevin's car engine and the rhythmic beating of his heart as he drove through the lonely stretch of road. Kevin had spent the entire evening working as a rideshare driver, picking up passengers from bars, diners, and motels. It was a long, exhausting job, but it paid well enough, and he didn't mind the solitude. His last passenger for the night was a middle-aged man, dressed in a heavy coat and reeking of cheap whiskey. He had slurred his address before immediately slumping over in the back seat, his snores rattling through the car. Kevin didn't think much of it. Drunk passengers were a regular part of the job. But as he drove deeper into the fog-laced highway, something felt off. The air inside the car felt heavy, as if some unseen force was pressing against his chest. He shivered, even though the heater was blasting. His hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. Then he saw it. Up ahead, emerging from the dense wall of fog, was a figure stumbling out of the ditch at the side of the road. Kevin's stomach clenched. The man was barefoot, his clothes tattered and soaked in something dark. His posture was twisted. One arm hung limply by his side, his other hand outstretched, as if begging for help. He walked with a strange, jerky movement, his legs dragging as if they were broken. Kevin slowed down slightly, his pulse quickening. His instincts screamed at him to keep driving. But what if this was a real person? What if someone had been in an accident and was barely clinging to life? His headlights washed over the man, and his breath caught in his throat. The man's face was horrifically disfigured. His jaw was barely attached, hanging at an unnatural angle, as if it had been shattered by a powerful force. One of his eyes was milky white, while the other socket was a gaping black hole, dripping with something thick and dark. And yet, he smiled. A wide, unnatural grin stretched across his ruined face. Kevin's body screamed at him to get out of there, but before he could react, the man took a step forward. His bare feet scraped against the asphalt, leaving behind smears of blood. His head twitched, his neck snapping at an unnatural angle, and in the dim glow of the headlights, Kevin could see something moving beneath his skin, as if something else was inside him, trying to crawl out. Kevin's chest tightened with pure primal fear. He slammed his foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, tires screeching against the frozen road. He expected the man to jump out of the way, but instead, the figure vanished into the mist, disappearing in the blink of an eye. Then, bang! A loud thud shook the car from behind. Kevin jerked in his seat, his hands clenching the wheel. It felt like something had landed on the trunk. His breath came in sharp gasps as he glanced in the rearview mirror, and his blood turned to ice. The man was in the back seat. He was sitting right next to the drunk passenger, his disfigured face inches away, his lips still curled into that grinning rictus of death. His hollow socket pulsed, dark fluid oozing down his cheek. His body was twisted at impossible angles, his limbs bent in ways no humans should be. And then he spoke. But his voice was not human. A deep, guttural, inhuman whisper slithered into Kevin's ears, chilling him to the core. "You should have stopped." Kevin's breath hitched, his entire body paralyzed with terror. His mind screamed at him to move, to do something, but he could barely think. Then the drunk passenger suddenly gasped awake, his body convulsing as if something was inside him, controlling him. His eyes rolled back, his mouth gaping open in a silent scream. Kevin couldn't take it anymore. With a desperate yell, he slammed on the brakes. The car skidded violently, tires screeching against the pavement before finally coming to a jerking stop. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he whipped around. The back seat was empty. The drunk passenger was unconscious again, his face peaceful as if nothing had happened. But Kevin knew. He hadn't imagined it. His entire body shook as he forced himself to drive. He needed to get out of there. Now. When he finally reached the passenger's apartment complex, he quickly parked, heart still hammering. He turned to wake the man up. But the second his fingers touched the man's wrist, a horrifying chill shot through his body. The man's skin was ice cold. Kevin's stomach twisted. He placed his shaking fingers on the man's neck. No pulse. The man was dead. Kevin scrambled out of the car, his breath ragged. He could barely think straight. The guy had been alive when he picked him up. He had been snoring. But now, he was lifeless, his face frozen in a look of silent terror. And then, he noticed the windows. Bloody handprints smeared across the glass. A loud knock suddenly echoed from the trunk of the car. Kevin froze. His entire body went cold. Slowly, he turned toward the trunk. His breath hitched, his shaking fingers reaching for the latch. With a trembling hand, he flung the trunk open. There was nothing inside, just an empty space, except for a single blood-stained footprint. Kevin never spoke about that night again. But some say the man in the ditch was a hitchhiker who died on that very highway decades ago, hit by a speeding car and left to die alone in the cold. Now he waits on the roadside, searching for a new victim. Some say if you're driving down Highway 93 on a foggy night, you might see him standing by the ditch. Or worse, he might already be in your back seat. Highways stretch for miles, cutting through vast emptiness, winding through dense forests, and passing by forgotten places. By day, they seem ordinary, just roads leading from one destination to another. But at night, they transform into something else entirely. The isolation, the darkness, and the eerie silence make them the perfect setting for unexplained encounters and terrifying events. From shadowy figures lurking by the roadside to vehicles that appear and vanish without a trace, highways hold secrets that many travelers wish they never stumbled upon. These disturbing stories are just a glimpse into the many horrors that have been witnessed on lonely roads. But we know there are countless other chilling tales out there. Have you ever experienced something strange, unsettling, or outright terrifying while driving? Maybe you've seen something you couldn't explain, or had an encounter that still haunts you to this day. If so, we want to hear your story. Send us your true highway horror stories, and we might feature them in our next collection of disturbing tales. Share your experience, because the truth is, some roads are more than just a way to get from one place to another. Sometimes, they lead straight into the unknown. Stay safe, stay alert, and remember, not every traveler on the highway is human.